On the 12th of June 2023, a 57-year-old woman disappeared without a trace in Bethelsdorp. She had last been seen around 10 a.m. when she left her home that morning. Little did anyone know that the reason for her disappearance was due to a danger that lurked within her safe space, the very walls that she called home. Her perpetrator, no stranger. The crime, so brutal. Yet another illustration of the disturbing state of affairs in South Africa. This is the heart-wrenching case of Desiree Baartman. Hello and welcome back to Murder and Mayhem, a South African true crime, with me, your host, Bella Monsoon. For those of you still here after my recent absence, well, you're kind of awesome. I could very well explain where I've been, but I think I'll save that for a separate video or a different platform, because there is a lot we have to discuss. But if this is your first time seeing me and you're new to the channel, let me tell you who I am and what I do. If you're returning, you know the drill. There's a timestamp on screen where you can skip ahead. So please don't be coming at me in the comment section telling me that you had to watch the whole intro because I didn't let you know when the real video started. Despite me mentioning the timestamp in the beginning of all my videos, you'd be surprised how many times I get that comment. But I digress. So here it is in a nutshell. I'm a registered mental health professional who just so happens to be obsessed with makeup, true crime, and uncovering the motives that drive people to do what they do. My intimate knowledge and experience within the field thus led me to create the first South African trauma-informed true crime series. Within this series, every new video looks at a real-life crime from a psychological viewpoint. During these episodes, I also try to share psychological concepts and knowledge that you may or may not be aware of in an easy to understand format. So if all of that sounds like something that is right up your alley, then please do consider subscribing and joining the Bellaboo family. But if you're more a fan of podcasts, no worries, we do that too, and I've got you covered. You can find me for my sister podcast, Murder and Mayhem South African True Crime, available on all major streaming channels. So just a quick disclaimer for today's episode. Today's narrative contains material citing murder and gender-based violence. As always, I mean absolutely no disrespect to the victim mentioned nor their family. The purpose of this video is to shed further light on the heinous crime that was committed while spreading awareness about the psychological nature of the narrative. As always, this episode has been thoroughly researched by myself and includes, where available, real-life accounts, footage, and images of and from individuals who were involved directly in the case. So, let's get into it. On the 12th of June 2023, 57-year-old Desiree disappeared without a trace. She had last been seen around 10 a.m. when she had left her home in Nigel Street, extension 29, Bethelsdorp. After not returning home and friends and family having no idea about her whereabouts and unable to contact her, she was reported missing officially on the 14th of June. But before we get into that, let's learn a little more about Desiree. Desiree Karen Hutton was born on May 20th, 1966 in Port Elizabeth. Growing up, she was the eldest of 5 siblings, all younger brothers. Her parents had moved to Middelburg for work opportunities in the local factories when they were all still children. There, Desiree would attend Middelland Senior Secondary School. A childhood friend, Lynette Douglas, would later fondly describe Desiree as being a good friend, a confidant, and someone who always offered a shoulder to cry on. When Lynette had been diagnosed with cancer and was receiving chemo, Desiree would stay over on some nights, do her makeup before chemo sessions, and basically walked that difficult journey with Lynette, offering her unwavering support. And that was just the kind of person that Desiree was. After finishing school a few years later, Desiree started working at Standard Bank in Middelburg in 1987. And in September of 1990, when she was in her mid-20s, she got married to a man named Johnny Baartman. He was a high school teacher. She was later transferred to the Port Elizabeth Standard Bank branch, and so the family had moved there. Her love of life continued to grow, with her loving dancing and cooking. She was also incredibly social and enjoyed hosting dinner parties and sleepovers. She would be fondly described as a genuinely lovely person to be around, always happy and laughing. And with this beautiful outlook on life, she would soon bring 2 children into the world, a son and a daughter, both of whom would become her entire world. She adored her children. She loved them unconditionally, always bragging about them and their achievements on her WhatsApp statuses and social media pages. She was so very proud of everything that they had achieved. Her best friend, Karen Dry, would describe Desiree as a beautiful person with an amazing personality, always vibrant, happy, and someone who loved a good party. Although she had been married to Johnny for 22 years, after experiencing an incredibly difficult situation, more on that later, the two had gone their separate ways. On the 28th of August 2012, they were officially divorced. The couple, however, would continue to live together, allegedly later, according to Johnny, for the well-being of their children. In 2020, Desiree had survived the illness that plagued the world, and as a result, she felt as though God had given her a second chance at life. And so she made a point to live life to the fullest, to make every single day count. At this point in time, the Baartman children had grown up and left the home. The daughter thought to have been settled in Gauteng, and the son still living in the area. Things at home were not ideal though, as neighbors of the pair would later state that the two argued often. They were both relatively private individuals, although Desiree was the friendlier of the two, always greeting everyone she saw in the vicinity of their home. She would sometimes visit with other neighbors, sharing laughs and good times too. Johnny, on the other hand, was not known as being that social by neighbors, and allegedly did not speak to anyone that he came across in their street. It was evident, though, that the pair had a strained relationship, and often avoided one another even though they shared a home. And it was in that environment that the days passed, eventually leading up to June 12th of 2023. Although the exact chain of events will only be discussed later in this episode, as they were only divulged later in the case, what we do know is that on this day, Desiree would disappear without a trace. However, it was only on the 14th, after failing to reach her through multiple channels, her son, accompanied by his father, her ex-husband, would report her missing at the Bethelsdorp police station. After a very interesting phone call, more of which will be discussed later, that Friday the 16th and Saturday the 17th, SAPS and forensic experts investigated the Baartman home for evidence. And it was at this point in time that things would snowball. On the 17th of June, following the preliminary findings of the police team indicating foul play in the form of blood splatter on the walls, Johnny would be detained for further questioning. A firearm was also confiscated from the home. The police had then opened up a case of attempted murder. Yes, against none other than Johnny Baartman. At this point in time, though, there was still no sign of Desiree, and the police had appealed to the public for any information that could assist in the case. But no one could help. The K9 Search and Rescue Unit and the Anti-Gang Unit also conducted multiple searches in the nearby areas with no results. Back on the ranch though, or in this case the police cells, Johnny had attempted to harm himself. Following this attempt, he was then admitted to the Livingston Hospital on the 18th of June. After receiving treatment, he was discharged into police custody. On the 20th of June, Johnny Baartman, who was 59 years old at the time, was provisionally charged with premeditated murder and defeating the ends of justice. This despite the fact that Desiree was still missing. This may come as a surprise to some, but interestingly enough, in 2005, another South African man, William Nguna, was found guilty and sentenced to life for killing his partner, Frances Rasuga, even though her body was only discovered 8 years after her 2004 disappearance. Unfortunately, in many of these cases, both locally and worldwide, the spouse or ex-spouse is often the first person of interest. Johnny's charge sheet would state that he acted unlawfully and with intent to defeat or obstruct the course of justice, cleaned the scene of evidence, and then hid the body of Desiree Baartman. During the initial court proceedings, he appeared emotional and teary-eyed as he announced that he had abandoned his bail application. He had made sure to keep his head down, avoiding eye contact with those seated behind him, and he simply wept to himself. It was also publicly announced at this point that he had sustained self-inflicted injuries to his wrists. For this reason, he was also placed on a watch list and was being held in a single cell at the Bethelsdorp police station. With his initial court appearance concluded, Desiree, however, was still missing. A candlelight vigil was held for her that evening and attended by more than 100 friends and family members. Throughout the session, there were songs of hope, with the prayer that Desiree would be found safe. At the gathering, her brother would say, and I quote, "It has been more than 7 days and we don't know where she is. We just want our sister. We want to know where she is and we want our sister back. Our sister is vibrant, outgoing, and friendly. She has many friends. She loves singing. We are still hopeful that she will be found safe." Unfortunately, though, that prayer would not be answered. Just hours after that vigil, the very same evening, the body of Desiree was discovered. 3.7 meters down a stormwater drain next to Stanford Road near the Jachtersvlakte area. And that discovery was courtesy of Johnny. At around 9 p.m., he had led South African Police Service detectives along with the Canine Search and Rescue Diving Unit to recover her body. The area she was found in was littered with waste and rubble, with the nearest homes far enough away for them to have not seen a thing. An autopsy was then set to be conducted to determine the exact cause of death. The outcome would later state that Desiree died as a result of wounds consistent with blunt force trauma to the head and thorax, with the majority of this force being applied to the neck. In the meantime, Johnny appeared once again in court, this time with more definitive charges. However, his case was then postponed to allow him to be psychologically evaluated to assess whether he was fit to stand trial. During this court appearance, he failed to make eye contact with any of his family members, including his 2 children. He would, however, later tell the court that he was ready to confess, and in his own words, tell them everything. At his next court appearance, Johnny would admit to killing Desiree and cleaning the blood from the crime scene. He stated, however, that he was provoked by her before committing the crime, and that it was not premeditated. He also told the court that he wished for the case to be resolved quickly. The district surgeon whom he saw would later report that although he was emotional and regretted what happened, he was still cognizant enough to try and hide the body and clean the house. At this particular court appearance, Johnny appeared unemotional and apathetic. His trial, however, could not commence as he was waiting a psychological evaluation. And if you're aware of how long that can take in South Africa, well, you'll know that no one was holding their breath. Some cases are put on hold for over a year, sometimes longer, whilst awaiting psychological evaluation. The truth of the matter is that mental health in South Africa is understaffed and high in demand. Surprisingly enough, though, just 2 months later, in August of 2023, a bed at Fort England Psychiatric Hospital in Makanda was secured for Johnny. The case was thus postponed to the 15th of September. For some reason, though, it would only be in October, however, when Johnny would check in for his observation. He then spent the 20th of October to the 15th of November there. In December of 2023, however, the report was out and communicated that Johnny Baartman showcased no mental illness or intellectual difficulty. It further stated, and I quote, "At the time of the alleged offense, the accused was able to appreciate the wrongfulness of the act in question and able to act in accordance with such appreciation of wrongfulness." Johnny was thus deemed fit to stand trial. Family members, along with his children, were there to witness these court proceedings. In February of 2024, the case resumed, with Johnny appearing virtually via the Automated Voice Response AVR system. According to the state prosecutor, the virtual appearance was to minimize the flight risk that was posed by an in-person appearance. It was, however, not further stated why they believed that Johnny was a flight risk, though. Once again, after this very brief appearance, the case was postponed to the 27th of March to allow for further investigation. As time had progressed from his arrest, Johnny Baartman appeared to grow in confidence, with his demeanor changing significantly from his very first appearance. In March of 2024, at his very next appearance, word was heard that a plea deal was on the cards. A month later, the case was transferred to the High Court and scheduled for a pre-trial conference on the 29th of April. A few days later, though, everything drew to a very quick conclusion. On the 3rd of May 2024, Johnny Baartman was sentenced in the Eastern Cape High Court to 25 years imprisonment with an additional 5 years for defeating the ends of justice. The sentence sentences are set to run concurrently. The sentence was reached as a result of a plea deal with the state, in which one of the conditions involved the disturbing details of Desiree's murder being disclosed in court. According to the statement, this is what apparently happened on the day Desiree's life was stolen. Keep in mind I say apparently, because this sequence of events is according to the perpetrator, and the only other person who could corroborate the information being shared is no longer around to do so. That being said, as I promised earlier in this episode, let's get into it. On the day of the 12th of June in 2023, Johnny had apparently had a severe headache when arriving home at around 6 p.m. When he had walked in the front door, Desiree had not been there. He had then headed off to a nearby shop to purchase some painkillers and electricity before arriving back home and settling in for a nap. Before doing so, however, he noticed that Desiree had been in the kitchen preparing dinner. He would then later wake up around 9 p.m. and head to the lounge area. In the lounge, the television was on, but Desiree was apparently nowhere to be seen. He had then changed the channel to a sports program. It was a few moments later when, according to Johnny, Desiree had entered the lounge and confronted him aggressively about changing the television channel. He had then apparently told her that he thought the room was empty and she wasn't using the television. At that point in time, for some reason, apparently to de-escalate the situation, according to Johnny, he left the house to get a pie and cool drink from the car that he had purchased earlier but just left in his vehicle. Slightly odd, because why would you leave a cool drink in your car? But whatever. When returning back to the home, he then had discovered that Desiree had locked the kitchen door, effectively locking him out. He had then banged on the door to be let in. At first, she had ignored him. However, after a while, she had opened the door, stood in the doorway, and then verbally abused him, apparently hurling profanities at him, demanding for him to leave the premises. He had then tried to squeeze past her, but her verbal abuse had then allegedly turned physical, as she had smacked him on the back of the head. It was apparently at this point that Johnny had turned violent, grabbing Desiree by the throat and strangling her. He had then grabbed the handle of the wooden pickaxe that was kept by their kitchen door. The pair had then begun to struggle, moving towards the passageway of the home. They had both fallen to the ground, with Johnny ending up on top of Desiree. Then it was apparently Desiree who had grabbed an ornamental Absolute vodka bottle that was covered in a leatherette case and studs and attempted to assault Johnny with it. She had, however, been unsuccessful, and Johnny had then grabbed it from her and began to hit her with it, focusing his blows on her head. Although he could have stopped at any point because she was without a weapon and defenseless, he continued to physically assault her, this time with the pickaxe wooden handle continuously on her upper body area, focusing on her head. It was only after she had stopped moving and had subsequently passed on that he had stopped. At this point, he had allegedly been in a state of shock, and thus he had decided to go and visit his sister, who lived in Kariga, about a 20-minute drive, to confess his actions. And so he left the house, got into his car, and started driving. On the way, though, he missed the Etenhage exit and stopped where the road ended. He had then suddenly, out of the blue, noticed a stormwater drain. Okay. Not suspicious in the least. At this point, he abandoned his initial mission and decided that this location, less than a kilometer away from the home, would be the perfect place to hide the body of the mother of his children, the body of the woman whose life he had just stolen. Upon returning back to the house, he had realized that apparently he had left the back door opened in his haste to leave. The crime scene was covered in a large amount of blood, and Johnny figured that the only way to manage the bleeding was to wrap Desiree's head in several towels, placing her body in a sleeping bag. He then zipped up the bag and transported her in the back seat of his vehicle before disposing of her body in the drain. He had used that very same pickaxe to open the heavy drain cover. After apparently driving around for a while, he had returned home at 4 a.m., mopped up the blood, and went to sleep. Later that morning, however, he was back at it, further cleaning the blood-stained areas of the home. As I had previously mentioned, a day or so later, on the 14th of June, their son had become concerned as to where Desiree was, as all efforts to contact her had failed. Thus, Johnny had played the role of the caring father and ex-husband, and had actually accompanied the young man to the police station to report Desiree missing. It would only be a few days later when he had confessed to the warrant officer in the case and would subsequently be arrested. He would later state, and I quote, "I submit that I initially acted in self-defense, but was thereafter so overcome with rage, I started to beat the deceased continuously on her head and body with the direct intention of killing her. I admit my actions were wrongful, unlawful, and intentional." Look, I agree with everything stated there, except for that little bit about self-defense. As far as I'm aware, she didn't have access to a weapon which she was pointing at him or using on him, and she did not appear to be the stronger of the two. But anyways, during the retelling of the events of the 12th, Johnny wept uncontrollably in court. His lawyer stated to the court that Johnny was aware of his consequences and his actions and how they affected his loved ones. His lawyer had further added, and I quote, "The accused intends to change his ways and look upon his incarceration as an opportunity to better his ways, to study further, to learn more skills and devote more time to religion, to try and rehabilitate himself." After his sentence was read, he was allowed to say goodbye to his family privately in the witness room. Desiree's family thanked the media for their coverage of her disappearance and stated that their intentions were now to move forward together. Friends close to the family stated that it was in the children's best interest for Johnny to remain a part of their lives instead of receiving a life sentence. The Baartman children, now adults, were struggling to come to terms with the heinous crime that their father had committed, and one can only imagine the vast array of emotions they must be experiencing. Unfortunately, in cases like these, there are no winners, no matter how things turn out. Desiree's family has lost a mother, a grandmother, a sister, and a pure light in their lives. Desiree's children have lost not only their mother, but now live with the knowledge that their loss is due to their father, a man who will spend many of the next years in prison, paying with his life for the life he stole. Their children, Desiree and Johnny's grandchildren, will miss many special moments with their grandparents as they grow up. Two entire families and a community forever altered. And the thing is, if you're at all familiar with true crime worldwide, but especially in South Africa, cases like these are far more common than they should be, especially in the Nelson Mandela Bay Metro. In the recent years, many cases originating in this area have made the news and shocked the nation. Cases like the murder of Vicky Terblanche, whose estranged husband currently stands accused of orchestrating her murder. Cases like Jade Panyoto, whose husband was later sentenced to prison for her murder. Cases like Avril Gordon, I actually covered this one, whose husband kept her chained up in their bathroom and who, for all intents and purposes, would have become another victim if neighbors hadn't discovered her in time. According to statistics in South Africa, more than 20% of women in partnerships have experienced physical violence by a partner. Keep in mind that that percentage is only reported abuse and only physical abuse. Because let's face it, we all know that violence comes in many forms, and more often than not, it goes unreported. However, the facts and the stats speak for themselves, in that in the Eastern Cape alone, there are the highest number of women who experienced physical violence from a partner. In the case of Johnny Baartman, although he had a previous assault charge that he was later acquitted from, more on that soon, his inability to contain and manage his anger and outbursts led to the explosive actions that took the life of Desiree, something that was completely avoidable. So let me explain a little bit more about what I meant when I said previous assault charge. During Johnny's court appearances, it also came to light that he was not a complete stranger when it came to the law. He had a previous conviction of driving under the influence of alcohol, for which he had been fined 2,000 rand. But more notably, the thing that would make the news time and time again in this case was the accusation of from a 14-year-old pupil he used to teach. It was 2011 when 48-year-old Johnny, who was a business, science, and economics teacher at Sancta High School in what was known as Port Elizabeth at the time, was accused. The then 14-year-old girl had alleged that Johnny, who had been a teacher for around 22 years at this point in time, had driven her to a bushy area near Extension 24 in Bethelsdorp, where he had then her in his vehicle. This interaction had allegedly occurred in early September of 2011. She also claimed that on a separate occasion he had fondled her breasts in the school library and that he had been messaging and calling her multiple times. As you can imagine, Johnny was fired from the school shortly afterwards. And a year or so later, his marriage with Desiree would fall apart, and one could only assume that this incident had some role to play. And thus he was left, bitter, isolated, and full of resentment. In 2014, however, 3 years after the initial accusation and after standing trial, he was acquitted. This came about after Dr. Nadine Peterson, who was stationed at the local trauma unit, had testified that there was no trauma seen within the young girl's body to indicate the assault had taken place. She had furthermore stated that the girl's hymen was also still intact and not perforated. She indicated that if an assault by an adult had taken place, there would have been tearing or some sign of trauma, and that this would have been visible for at least 2 weeks after the incident. She had examined the girl on the 7th of September 2011, 3 days after the alleged incident had taken place. Now, when conducting some research, as I do, there is a vast majority of information online that suggests that using the hymen as a measure of virginity is not always accurate. In fact, it's not even scientific. Furthermore, there is no physical examination or test that can showcase or prove virginity. And I was hoping that that information was common knowledge by now. So hearing that kind of statement, if it was indeed reported correctly initially, is kind of disturbing, to say the least. Unfortunately, there is so much of research on this entire topic due to the disturbing practices that occur in many cultures around the world. So I'm about to get a little scientific for a moment, so bear with me. For those who are not aware, the hymen is an elastic membrane. Thus, according to experts, it can be penetrated without breaking, and thus it is not a valuable nor scientific sign of virginity. That being said, that membrane can also erode or tear as a result of physical activity, such as horse riding or gymnastics, using feminine hygiene products, or even pleasuring oneself. Researchers worldwide have confirmed that virginity testing is a form of gender discrimination, as well as a violation of fundamental rights. And the results, which have no scientific basis, can be used to not only discredit alleged victims, but also to judge whether a woman is fit to marry or if she's had an extramarital affair. And there is a bunch of other reasons why these tests are conducted, and I promise you, the more you research into it, the more disturbing it gets. But yeah, before I digress too far, do with that information what you will. So, in addition to the report by the doctor, cell phone records also went on to disprove the allegations that this girl had been constantly phoned and messaged by Johnny. At the time of his acquittal, Johnny had said, and I quote, "This was the first time an allegation was made against me. I was very involved with the school. I even coached athletics." Once acquitted, though, Johnny had decided to sue not only the girl, but the Eastern Cape Education Department and the National Prosecuting Authority, the NPA, for 8 million rand in damages. The case was eventually settled out of court. I'm not entirely sure what that settlement was, though, as it was not made public. What we do know is that regardless of the validity of the accusations, Johnny's reputation was tarnished, as according to the media, his image was published in the newspaper, which negatively affected not only himself, but his children. He was constantly surrounded by speculation, much like the speculation one faces when ascertaining the events of that tragic night in June. All we really have to go on is Johnny's version of events. And this coming from the very same man who hid the murder and the body in the first place. We cannot know for certain, therefore, whether Desiree did do any of the things that Johnny claimed. But we do know that there weren't any reported or documented injuries on himself or his body, which means that Desiree didn't see it coming or didn't have the chance to fight back. At any point in time, Johnny could have stopped, but yet he played out his anger repeatedly on Desiree until the life had left her body. And then, although allegedly still in shock, he was able to devise a plan to dispose of her body and clean the crime scene. And I don't know about you, but if you've ever been in a traumatic situation, organizing details of anything is often the last thing that's on your mind. Maybe that's just me though? In any case, there's a reason that there should be a focus on men, in particular, reaching out and receiving assistance in processing and handling their emotions. Because the longer repressed anger remains undealt with, the more innocent women will have to pay the price. And before anyone says anything, because I know some of you are way too comfortable being keyboard warriors, therapy and emotional processing is obviously integral for everyone. However, from my personal experience dealing with clients, it's often those who didn't cause the pain that end up seeking the help. Often because the individual who the negative emotions are stemming from hasn't even considered therapy. In short, people in therapy are often in therapy to deal with the people in their lives that won't go to therapy. I said what I said. So back to Johnny and how this is all relevant. As I previously discussed, Johnny was accused of inappropriate conduct with a 14-year-old. Although he would ultimately be acquitted of that charge, he lost his job, his marriage, and his reputation was tarnished. Also, on a side note, there is an entire conversation that needs to be held about false accusations, because often I've found that men use these types of cases, aka Johnny being acquitted for the assault, to justify not believing women in every other instance. But because I am a woman of research, here are some facts for you. The percentage of false allegations currently sits around 2 to 4% worldwide, according to multiple studies. Believing that the occurrence of false allegations are more prevalent than they are is harmful for society, and most importantly, for victims of sexual offenses. Not only does it lead to an increased fear of disbelief and blame if one reports a crime, but it also leads to an increase of underreporting. The percentage of offenses cases that go unreported is often thought to be closer to 70%. Think about it. Have you, the listener, ever experienced a sexual assault, or had someone close to you go through a similar experience? Did you or they end up reporting it? More than likely, that answer is probably no. And that's for a multitude of reasons, with just a few of the contributing ones being mentioned prior. And one last point to mention is that the likelihood of incarceration due to false allegations is rare. I mean, I've personally worked with so many women who have all the evidence, and yet they still struggle to get their case taken seriously. I'm just saying. Keeping all of that in mind, it of course doesn't take away from the knock-on effects of such allegations, but I think it's vital to ensure that we do not throw the baby out with the bathwater, and that the other 98% of cases are taken seriously. So whether or not the accusation was true in some way or form is not something I can or will debate now, but what we can explore is the effect that it had on Johnny's life. Without being able to find other work as a teacher, he was unemployed, unable to provide for his family, and by all means feeling incredibly insufficient as a man. According to societal norms, that is. He lost his marriage most likely as a result of those accusations, and his relationship with his children would have inevitably taken strain. And so there he was over the years, unable to process the anger and resentment he felt in regards to that accusation, trial, and dismissal, living with the deep-seated feelings of inadequacy and bitterness. So essentially what I'm trying to get at is that being able to process emotions, especially as a man, is something that has been overlooked in society for years. Men have traditionally been raised to be men, aka not be in touch with their feelings or even acknowledge their weaknesses. And this upbringing and societal belief system has only assisted in further sculpting the kind of men who project their undealt with emotions onto others. And for as long as this remains the status quo and the way of being, those more vulnerable, in many cases women, will remain the victims of these perpetrators. Women like Desiree, women like Vicky, women like Jade, and women like Avril. Women who could possibly lose their lives over a television channel being changed. Let that sink in. So until next time, stay safe, stay blessed, stay vigilant, and stay the amazing human beings that I know you are or are capable of being. Bye!